So I'll begin this morning by making confession. The thing that I worried most about in preparing for this today was that I had forgotten to tie a tie. It's been 6 years and everything is business casual now. And so I haven't worn a tie for that time. It worked out okay. It's good to see you all here. I love that version of Stand By Me. It's really beautiful. I came across it as I was looking for other things on the internet. How did we live without the internet for me at least, most of my life? So vulnerability. Sometime around 3 weeks ago, I received a request from a nurse in the neuroscience unit to visit a patient there who I'll call David. David was having an especially difficult time. He'd been admitted the previous day after experiencing a seizure at home, something that had never happened to him before, and which can be very frightening. As I typically do before visiting a patient for the first time, I took a few minutes to review some entries in his medical record. I learned that David was 42, he was married, and living in a city about an hour's drive from the Crosse, where he was a physical education instructor and coach. He had 3 children, a 10-year-old son, an 8-year-old daughter, and a 6-year-old son, and he'd been quite healthy. There had been very few visits to the hospital for him. David's chart also told me that the results from lab tests and MRI scans revealed that his seizure was due to a previously undiagnosed tumor in his brain. He had cancer. As I got into the elevator to the 4th floor, I found myself forming an image of David based on the information in the chart. In my mind, I envisioned a fairly large, fairly fit, muscular man. And because most of the physical education instructors and coaches I'd known had short Marine-style haircuts, I expected that he also would have a short Marine-style crew cut. I didn't expect David to reveal much of his emotional inner life, because that also goes along with men who are firm and strong and have crew cuts. I expected a tough guy who would probably clench his jaws, grind his teeth, and tell me, everything's fine. The last thing I need right now is a chaplain. Sometimes when we go in a room, people think that they're dying. That's why the chaplain is showing up. We try to get around that. And guess what? When I knocked on the door and entered David's room, I found a large, fairly fit man with a Marine-style crew cut who appeared to be clenching and grinding his teeth. To get the complete picture here, I need to tell you a little about myself when I was in school. I was almost always the last boy picked when we split up to make teams. Some of the most difficult moments of my adolescence were either the work of large, fit men with Marine-style crew cuts, or of classmates who I assumed would eventually grow up to be large, fit men with Marine-style crew cuts. So there I was, a chaplain, about to enter the room of someone who probably didn't want to see me, and in all honesty, whom in all candor, I wasn't eager to see either. I have a centering meditation that I say to myself as I'm about to enter a room before a visit with a patient, and it goes like this. May I be open, attentive, and present. May I lead with curiosity. May I listen deeply and speak compassionately. May I be an instrument of love. For this visit, I had to say it twice. And so I walked in. The room was dark, except for the flickering light of the TV. As I moved toward David, I said, I'm Chaplain Greg from Spiritual Care. Can I sit with you for a while? He didn't answer. He didn't say a word. But I took his silence as quiet consent and pulled up a stool to sit next to the bed. And then there was silence and more silence. David's eyes stayed focused on the TV. After what felt like several minutes, still gazing at the TV, David whispered, my boy's going to be trying out for a spot on one of the teams in the summer baseball league, he said quietly. A few seconds later, I watched his eyes moisten a bit as he finally looked toward me and said, and I may not get to see him play. David's jaws clenched again. He held his breath, pushing back against the tears that were forming. He blurted out, "I might not get to see any of my kids grow up." And with that, he began to gasp for air, breathing like this, trying to hold his breath to avoid the tears that were welling up. I placed my hand on his shoulder, hoping I might help calm him enough to catch his breath. And when I did that, something completely unexpected happened. As I had my hand on his shoulder, he laid his head against my hand like this and cried and cried and cried. He kept crying, and soon I was crying too. As we leaned in toward one another, he moaned, "This is hard." And all I could think of saying was, "Yes, this is really, really hard." But that was enough. David and I were experiencing a deeply human connection that comes when two people can be vulnerable with one another. My moment with David happened because of vulnerability. I needed to be vulnerable enough to lay aside my preconception and open myself to the possibility of being re-traumatized by memories from high school. I had to expose my cracks. He had to be vulnerable enough to give expression to his deep existential anguish. He thought he was dying, and he may be. He risked being discounted and wounded by crying. He risked exposing his cracks. In her best-selling book, Daring Greatly, Brené Brown reminds us that our English word vulnerable is derived from the Latin vulnerare, which means to wound or to be capable of being wounded and being open to attack or damage. In contrast, Brené Brown writes that weakness is defined by the inability to withstand attack or wounding. She goes on to say that one could argue that weakness often stems from a lack of vulnerability, when we don't acknowledge how and where we're tender. She writes, "We're more at risk of being hurt when that happens." Now I'm going to be a little vulnerable about myself and tell a little bit about my story. Hospital chaplaincy wasn't something I ever expected doing full time. Growing up in a Lutheran family, I felt a call to ministry at a young age, and my course of undergraduate studies were designed to prepare me for seminary. I attended Bethel, an evangelical Baptist college in St. Paul, not because I had a special affinity for Baptists or evangelicals, but because I would be able to get an accredited undergraduate social work degree while also taking courses in Christian history, theology, and New Testament Greek. Throughout those years, I had a growing awareness that I was gay. I started out thinking, like many LGBTQ Christians, that I could pray away my homosexual tendencies. If I was sufficiently sincere and faithful, God would cure me of this dreadful condition. During my senior year at Bethel, I began counseling sessions with a change-oriented therapist. In 1981, I enrolled in Luther Seminary. I was a good student, excelling in almost all my coursework and becoming a favorite of many of my professors. However, my homosexual tendencies weren't going away. If anything, they were getting stronger. I became distressed by what, at the time, I could only describe as my sinful nature. Things began to change, though, as I continued my studies, but not in the direction I'd expected. The shame I was feeling about being gay began to recede. My sense of self-compassion grew into self-acceptance, and I began to lean into my identity, taking risks to be more open about who I was authentically. And finally, in 1983, I came out as openly gay. I exposed my cracks. And I did this, if those of you who are old enough to remember the early 80s, those were the days of Anita Bryant, who was going around saying, "Save our children." She was promoting legislation that would allow the firing of gay and lesbian teachers in schools. She was the Sunshine Orange Lady and a former Miss America. So people were listening to her. I was also hearing people that I care deeply about saying, we don't have any gay or lesbian people in our town. They're not here. Why do we need to care about this? So I became brave enough to be vulnerable. And when I did that, the administration at Luther didn't really know what to do with me. They couldn't easily kick me out because my academic record was too strong for that. Eventually, I was invited to a meeting with the dean of students and my academic advisor. I was told that I could stay in school and continue my studies if I signed a written vow of celibacy. I thought for a few moments, and then I asked if every other single student on campus would also be signing a written vow of celibacy. And I got the unsurprising answer of no. Then I said that if I was being singled out and treated differently just because of who I was and who I had finally accepted as someone being worthy of love and respect, then this was fundamentally an injustice and I needed to leave. And so that day, I withdrew from seminary. And in doing that, I was overwhelmed by feelings of being lost, cast adrift from what had become for me an anchor. Soon after that, I discovered the open-minded and open-hearted community of Unitarian Universalists at First Unitarian Society in Minneapolis, where LGBTQ people were explicitly welcomed. I'm one of those folks, some of us can say, Unitarian Universalism sort of saved my life, and I really believe that. Fast forward 30 years. I'd successfully pursued a career in social work and public and nonprofit administration. My work had taken me to Washington, D.C., and then to New York City, where I lived for 15 years. Throughout that time, I was actively engaged in UU congregations. My sense of call to ministry never went away. And as I approached my 55th birthday, being of a certain age, I realized that while the window might soon be closing, I still had an opportunity to pursue ministry, this time as a Unitarian Universalist. And so in the fall of 2014, I enrolled in Andover Newton Theological School, which at the time was just outside Boston. I loved school. I'd lost track of the degrees I had. Having another one wasn't a problem. I loved living among and studying with fellow students from a wide spectrum of backgrounds and interests, some of whom I will say were transgender. I'd never been in a class with anyone who was transgender. I had 5 classmates in Andover Newton, of a class of 30 who were transgender, and it was explicitly because Andover Newton welcomed them. And I saw them as they went through their transition, some of them. I saw them as they got settled in ministry positions later on, and I grew to love those people. Like my seminary studies in the 1980s, I was establishing a strong, I clipped my papers together, here we go. Sorry about that. Don't do that next time. A strong academic record. I envisioned myself as a minister in a large, urban, socially and theologically progressive UU congregation, and I was on the road to get there. And then life got in the way. In February of 2015, an old, unhealed stomach ulcer ruptured. I experienced a life-threatening gastric bleed and was rushed to Boston's Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. Ultimately, I lost so much blood that my colon became ischemic during surgery and had to be removed. After a week in the ICU, I woke up to discover that my small intestine now drains its waste into a pouch that sits just below my waist. What's more, I had a fistula. A fistula is a hole in my stomach that took 11 months to close. And throughout that entire time, I was unable to eat normally and had to take all of my nutrition via a tube placed just below my stomach. I had an entire year that I had to take off school. And when my studies finally resumed, I found that I fatigued quickly and had difficulty concentrating. As I continued in my seminary program, I was no longer the academically gifted student I'd always been. I needed to ask for an ADA accommodation, extra time for exams, and extensions on deadlines to finish assignments. That was the only way I'd be able to complete my degree. This development also meant that I no longer had the capacity to serve in a ministerial leadership position in a UU congregation. I couldn't adjust to the demands of full-time parish ministry. There was a crack. There was a crack in everything. Fortunately, during my 2 months of hospitalization at Beth Israel Deaconess, I received spiritual care from a UU chaplain who helped me sort through the huge changes in my life. As I learned about her service as a chaplain, the possibility of chaplaincy work emerged in my mind and in my heart. The light of hope started to shine through the cracks. So here I am, many years later, serving in a richly fulfilling role as a chaplain at Gundersen, and having the privilege of getting to know you, the people of this amazing fellowship. In her book called To Care, Karen Hutt, a UU chaplain and educator of chaplains, writes that Unitarian Universalists, by nature of our openness to people of any faith or no faith, and our commitment to the inherent worth and dignity of every person, are an excellent fit with chaplaincy. She goes on to note that one of the founders of clinical pastoral education, which is the process, long and difficult, I will say, the process of training chaplains, that one of those founders was a Unitarian medical doctor named Richard Cabot. In 1925, he teamed with professors at Harvard Divinity School to combine the theological and healthcare-focused clinical education that became the model for the preparation and education of seminarians and chaplains today. In most denominations, a seminarian who's going into a parish has to have at least 1 unit or 3 full-time months of clinical pastoral education before they can be ordained. I had 9, by the way. I'm a slow learner. An important objective in chaplaincy is to foster healing through interpersonal connection. And that's not always easy, because health crises have a way of exposing fractures in relationships between family members. Patients and family members who've been estranged from one another for decades are suddenly faced with the prospects of someone dying without reconciliation, potentially leaving the surviving family member forever grieving the lost opportunities of forgiveness and amends making. Ira Bjach, a hospice physician, has addressed this in his book, The 4 Most Important Things, the 4 things that matter most. He's identified 4 interpersonal spoken phrases that almost inevitably lead to reconciliation, but they are also acts requiring immense vulnerability. The first is, please forgive me. Acknowledging and owning the pain that we have caused others. The second is, I forgive you. Together, these are radical acts of reconciliation. And he goes on to encourage gratitude then for one another as well. And the 4th one is the simple act of saying, thank you. Thank you. And finally, he's learned that these moments of reconciliation are sealed by each one saying to the other, I love you. Asking for forgiveness, forgiving, expressing gratitude, and saying I love you all require the courage to be vulnerable. Without it, healing of broken relationships cannot happen. Our first song this morning, When I'm Frightened, was a call for care and support. Our closing song, Lean on Me, is our response, call and response. So please stand as you're able in body or spirit and join us as we sing number 1021 in the Teal hymnals, Lean on Me.